In this presentation, we'll review the three branches of government which we did talk about in class. At this point, as I'm posting this video, please understand that all even day students have not gotten through the full PowerPoint. So we'll begin with the legislative branch. The legislative branch is considered bicameral because there's a Congress, and Congress has two houses. Bi is the prefix meaning two. So the House of Representatives and the Senate meet in the U.S. Capitol. Their main job is to make the laws. This is kind of why they were created. It's the most important job they have. They also approve the annual budget. Budget is a plan to spend money. Annual is every year. So understand, because they do approve it, they're not the ones making it. So sometimes, because the president makes it, if they are two different political parties, if there's a president that's a Democrat and a Congress that's Republican, sometimes tensions and friction does arise because Democrats and Republicans believe differently as to how money should be spent. The Congress is set to approve executive appointments. So even though we haven't talked about the president yet, the president does make appointments. He appoints judges to the Supreme Court. He appoints members to his cabinet, which is the group of people who advise him. He also appoints ambassadors to other countries. And so that he does not get too much power, the Congress has the right to approve or deny any of those appointments. And so a good example of this is when President Obama took office during his first term. He appointed a Supreme Court justice, and it was not approved by Congress. So at that point, he did appoint a second choice, which was Sonia Sotomayor, who became the first Hispanic American to sit on the Supreme Court. So she was approved by Congress. They can override the veto. And we talked about in class that the president can veto a bill, which means he does not put his stamp of approval on it. It means he doesn't want it to become law. If the president vetoes it so that he doesn't have too much power, that bill would go back to Congress, and Congress could override the veto. Please understand that overriding the veto is a very difficult thing to do. 2/3 of Congress have to agree to override it. The last thing we'll discuss in this presentation is impeaching the president. So although there are other powers that Congress has that we'll talk about throughout the year, and specifically when we get to talking about the legislative branch in depth, we'll just focus on impeaching the president as our last one. So basically, if the president does something wrong, Congress does have the right to impeach him or her. And what that means is that he or she could be removed from office, although that's not the only way to be impeached. You can be impeached and not removed from office. And there have been two presidents in history that have been impeached. Neither one of them was removed from office. The first was Andrew Johnson, and in class I had said that I was unfamiliar with the reason he was impeached, but I've done some research and found out that he was impeached because there was some disagreement between Congress and President Johnson, who took over for Lincoln. When he was assassinated, Johnson had a plan for Reconstruction, and Congress did not like it. And so there was quite a bit of tension between the two bodies, and it led to his impeachment. And the second one was President Clinton, and we said in class that he was impeached for inappropriate things going on in the White House. But again, he was not removed from office. We talked very briefly about President Nixon, who was not impeached because he actually resigned from the office of president before he could be impeached. He was pretty smart in knowing that he probably should have and would have been impeached and removed from office had he not resigned, because he took illegal actions. The executive branch is made up of a president. He also has a vice president, a cabinet, and federal agencies. The vice president, the cabinet, and federal agencies' main jobs are to advise and help the president. So the cabinet is a group of advisors, and the president chooses people who are experts in their field. to advise him on that field. Like, for example, you have a Department of Agriculture, you have a Department of Homeland Security, so on and so forth. The Vice President actually has very little power other than to be the President of the Senate. He does not have a voting role in the Senate unless there is a 50-50 tie. The main jobs of the president, the first is that he executes or enforces. It could also be called carries out the law. So what that means is he signs bills into law so that they take effect. This is his most important job, although he can veto it, which means it doesn't take effect. As mentioned previously during the slide about the legislative branch, the president can appoint judges, ambassadors, and cabinet, and I told the story of President Obama appointing Sonia Sotomayor to the Supreme Court. He vetoes bills, which means, again, he can deny it becoming law. He grants pardons, and what a pardon is it's like a forgiveness of a crime, so it kind of wipes the crime from your record. And it is very difficult to get a pardon. You can actually get a pardon at the state level from the governor, which is a little bit easier than getting a pardon from the president. And an example that I want to go back to Nixon is that when President Ford took over for him, he actually pardoned Nixon right away, not too long after he took office. And he actually caught a lot of flack from the American public because they felt like Nixon should have paid for his crimes. But that is one of the powers of the president. And so, again, Nixon was pardoned for his crimes. The president also prepares the annual budget. And what that means is he actually writes the budget. He decides what he thinks money should be spent on. The judicial branch is made up of the Supreme Court, the Court of Appeals, and the U.S. District Court. And this is kind of what the organization looks like. There is one U.S. Supreme Court in the United States. It is the highest court in the land. So whatever decision the U.S. Supreme Court makes is final. There is no court above it. There are 9 justices. There is no jury. So what that means is there's no trial. Basically, they review the decisions of lower courts. And that's what the appellate jurisdiction is. That means the case has already been heard. They're hearing it for the 3rd time. And sometimes there is original jurisdiction, which means they hear the case for the first time, but that's rare. The U.S. Court of Appeals is underneath the Supreme Court. There are several in the United States, and it's divided into basically what are known as districts or regions, and each district has its U.S. Court of Appeals. Again, there are only justices. It's a 3-justice panel, so there is no jury, so there would be no trial in the U.S. Court of Appeals either. They have what's called appellate jurisdiction, which means they do review the case that was heard in the court below it. The U.S. District Court is the lowest court in the United States. There are 94 of these throughout the United States. It has a judge and jury, so this is probably the type of court you are most familiar with from watching television or movies. It is a trial court, so this is where there are attorneys and witnesses and evidence presented, etc. That means they do have original jurisdiction because they're the first ones to hear the case. So the judicial branch's main job is to interpret the laws. Most people get very confused thinking that because the judicial branch decides guilt or innocence, their job is to enforce the law. But technically, they have to understand what the law says before they can say someone is guilty of breaking that law. So that means they interpret it. This can also mean that they sometimes compare it to the Constitution because, as we said, sometimes laws get made that do not match the Constitution, do not follow what it says. So in that case, they would have to review the law versus the Constitution. If they exercise the power of judicial review, that's kind of what they're doing, and they can declare the law unconstitutional. Sometimes they may need to declare executive actions unconstitutional. So something the president does may be against what the Constitution says. And that concludes our